U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has spearheaded efforts to renew Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Kerry has met with the two sides and regional leaders to establish a framework for the negotiations.
Meanwhile, Israelis are mourning the death of former Prime Minister and Commander Ariel Sharon, who spent 8 years in a coma before dying on January 11. Analysts say Mr. Sharon might have achieved a peace deal with the Palestinians had he not had the stroke that caused his coma.
But many Palestinians are celebrating the death of the man they call the Butcher. We'll talk with our Jerusalem correspondent Scott Bobb about that in a moment. But first, let's hear from Scott on the current peace efforts. Scott, Secretary Kerry has made focusing on Israeli-Palestinian peace a major goal during his time at the State Department. We've seen him now travel to the region a number of times. What exactly is he trying to do here with the two sides?
Well, Secretary Kerry is trying to get the negotiations, direct negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis started again. These had been on hold for more than 3 years. The two sides had not been meeting, weren't speaking together, and there's a lot of mistrust and tension. And so the purpose of this first round is to basically try to get them talking again, to build up some trust. And it's had different names. Right now they're using the term framework or just agreement, or the Palestinians just like to call it U.S. proposals. It's very tentative, and it's kind of diplomatic talk to basically say he's trying to get them to agree on things that they can start to talk about.
And you, Scott, have been covering this back and forth for years now. What can you tell us about that experience and give us sort of a historical perspective here?
From a historical perspective, there has been some progress. If you talk about Oslo and Camp David, and it seems like there are times where they actually do make some progress on certain issues. Territory, the borders of the state, which are it's still an issue out there, and things like that. They do break down, and often it's violence by extremists on either side that contributes to that. But so to be honest, from a historical perspective, they are in a better place than they were, let's say, 50 years ago, or after the 1967 war, or the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Do you view the circumstances currently as being more favorable for an agreement, for negotiations to resume than they have in the past?
I think it depends on the willingness and the political will of the parties, and I think that there's a bit more of that than there was certainly a year ago and 2 or 3 years ago. The second Intifada, which involved a lot of terrorist attacks on civilians, was a real setback, and a lot of Israelis just said they didn't believe they could trust the Palestinians, and the Palestinians felt the same way. It's still 5 major issues, if you'll permit me. One is territory, and that's the borders of any future 2 states. 2 is security, and that, of course, is very complicated. Right now they're talking about the Jordan Valley, but there are other issues involved. 3 is Jerusalem. The Palestinians want East Jerusalem as their capital, and some Israelis don't see that ever happening. 4 is the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, 3 million who left, and the Palestinians want them to have the right of return, and many Israelis refuse. And finally, the definition of a Jewish state, and this has to do with identity, and this is one of the most difficult issues, because the identity of the Jewish state, an Arab state, goes back centuries and centuries to Old Testament time.
Why should people outside of this region be paying attention to this? Why is resolving this issue, attempting to resolve this issue, so important to the world?
Well, I think if you just look at 9/11 and terrorist attacks in Europe and other parts of the world, one of the main complaints and demands of the attackers is the problem of the Palestinians. This is a main motivation for violence in the world, and for what have become increasingly spectacular and cruel attacks on innocent civilians and children and people of all religions and ethnic groups and so forth. And it's very difficult for people to get out of poverty when everything's being destroyed around you or undermined by a war effort. So just to mention 2, that's where I would go with it.
And that was our VOA Jerusalem correspondent Scott Bobb, who joins us now via Skype. He's going to talk to us again about Ariel Sharon, the former Israeli prime minister who passed away on January 11th. Now, Scott, tell us about this divisiveness over Mr. Sharon's legacy.
Well, I think as you noted earlier, he was detested by Palestinians because of his role in various military offensives, most notably the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Beirut in 1982 after Israel invaded Lebanon, but also just the settlement policies that uprooted Palestinians and created Jewish communities in their midst. However, many Israelis loved him and admired him as a war hero and someone who kept the state of Israel foremost in his mind. He also was a rancher and a farmer, a man of the earth, which appealed to them. But even among Israelis, he was controversial because some didn't like some of his policies. He was quite independent. And for example, when he unilaterally withdrew Israeli troops from Gaza in 2005 and destroyed the 5 Jewish settlements there, many Israelis hated that, and he was still unpopular among certain groups because of that. So it was a controversial man. But I would have to say that upon his death, Israelis united in praising him and eulogizing him and remembering his feats rather than his defeats.
Scott, critics would argue that Ariel Sharon was more controversial for the Palestinians than for anyone else on the planet. How does that affect the Palestinian-Israeli peace process?
Well, it doesn't really affect it much at all because if you recall, he was in a coma for 8 years and events had largely moved on. There has been some speculation because that he withdrew unilaterally from Gaza that perhaps he was contemplating something like that in the West Bank, which no political leader has had the political, shall we say, guts to do since then or to contemplate. There's too much opposition to it among certain portions of the Israeli electorate. So there's some speculation, but it's not clear on that. In terms of the current negotiations and talks, none whatsoever, really. The people, the American representatives came and praised him, eulogized him as they're supposed to do, and are hoping that perhaps there might be some impetus given just in his memory. But again, those talks remain severely deadlocked, and at the moment, no one is very optimistic.
And Scott, we did want to touch on that. You know, we've talked about Israeli and Palestinian perspectives on Sharon, but how has the global response been?
On Sharon, again, mixed. It depends on where you come down on the issue of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, where you come down on the military offensives. To many Israelis, they were necessary because they were under terrorist attack and under attack by Palestinian militants. So it just depends. But he was a polarizing figure, and that was the one thing about him was that he made his decisions and he took them and he implemented them, and he was good at that and perhaps less good at being a politician, a consensus builder, and the kind of politicians that we see today.